Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our latest live stream presentation. This presentation will be viewable afterward in the Grenada Genealogical and Historical Society's Facebook group and on YouTube. I'm Craig Cochran. I'm one of the admins of the Facebook group, and I'm joined by co-admin Philip Thorne, and we are thrilled to have today's guest with us, Dr. Felicia Fricke. Dr. Fricke is a British-Dutch scholar with family ties to the Dutch Caribbean. Her academic background includes archaeology, osteology, and oral history, and she received her PhD from the University of Kent in 2019. Presently, Dr. Fricke is a postdoctoral fellow at In the Same Sea, based in the University of Copenhagen. In the Same Sea investigates the shared history of the Lesser Antilles from the 1650s to the 1850s, and is the first systematic investigation of the combined history of the region. The team of In the Same Sea explores how the islands of the Lesser Antilles were shaped by inter-island connections. And Felicia's research focuses on the trade and exchange of resources between these islands. Today, Dr. Fricke will present the story of Antony O'Hannan. And during her presentation, Philip and I will be monitoring the comments for questions to address during the Q&A afterward. And so, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Felicia Fricke.
Thanks so much for that really lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for being here on a Sunday afternoon. I want to particularly thank Craig, Philip, Stephen and Angus for putting this together. It's a great honour and opportunity for me to be able to share my work in progress with you. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen, if possible. Here we go. So, yeah, as Craig said, I'm part of this history project at the University of Copenhagen, which looks at these interconnections between islands in the Lesser Antilles. And what I'm going to talk about today is just a small part of that project. But in order to explain where I'm going with it, I'm going to have to do quite a lot of background explanation. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my own research background, because I think that has a little bit of a bearing on how I've approached this and how I've come to be here today in this Zoom event. And then I will get to the extremely dramatic, wild story of Antony O'Hannan. Yeah, I'm pretty excited actually to present this because it's the first time I'm ever presenting any historical research. As Craig mentioned, I'm actually an archaeologist. So this is a new field for me, and it's also a new place for me. I've never studied in Grenada before. And also this is a very complicated story. It confused me a lot when I was researching it. So if you also get confused, I will understand. And yeah, I look forward to any questions that you have about it afterwards. So from my accent, you can probably tell that I grew up in England, but I also have Dutch nationality, and that's because my dad comes from Bonaire in the ABC Islands. And I still have several family members in Curacao. And this is why I chose to study in the Dutch Caribbean for my doctorate, which used data from artifacts, human remains, and oral history to look at the lives of enslaved people in the Dutch Caribbean. And I rewrote my thesis and published it as a book, which you can see here on the screen in 2020. So actually, yeah, this background in archaeology, but specifically in human remains analysis, is obviously quite different. And it's been really interesting for me to learn to be a historian. One of the first things that I did when I started this position at Copenhagen was to go to the archives at Kew in London and try and find any examples that I could of rumours passing between islands in the Lesser Antilles. And that's when I came across the case of Antony O'Hannan. So as you'll see over the next sort of 25, 30 minutes, this is not only a story about rumour, it's also about colonial governance, it's about the rights of enslaved and free people of colour, and it's also about the Catholic Church. And although this sounds very different to what I've been doing in the past, I think it does fit within my existing research interests. So When I was studying for my doctorate, I did do some work on Catholicism in Curacao. And I also have a personal interest in that my grandfather was a minister of religion in Bonaire in the 1950s. However, I should say, yeah, I've never been to Grenada. I've never studied Grenada before, so I'm very new and I'm almost certainly missing something. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this today. I think it's very common in academia, not only in history, in other fields too, for academics to publish the very interesting research that they found. And it's only once they've published it that everyone else gets to look at it and criticize it and say whether or not it's wrong, basically. So what I wanted to do was, come here today, show you what I'm working on before it gets published. And I really, really welcome any questions or criticisms that you might have after the presentation. So yeah, I will, without, actually no, first I'm just gonna show you something else. So this is just a quick slide with some of my other publications. They're mainly in archaeology and human remains analysis. If you're interested in any of these, then you're welcome to either try and get to them through my personal website, which you can see on the screen, or you can always email me and ask, and I can give you access to them. And now we start the story. So this story of Antony O'Hannan, it might be one that you've heard about before. For example, it's mentioned in John Angus Martin's new book, The A to Z of Grenada Heritage, published by Macmillan Caribbean. And O'Hannan has also been mentioned by several other authors in the past, from the sort of early 20th century onwards. So in 1932, a man called Raymond Devas published this book, very old, 1932, almost 100 years. And it's called Conception Island. And in this book, he described Antony O'Hannan quite negatively. He sort of portrayed him as this disgrace to the Catholic Church. But more recently, scholars have been writing about O'Hannan in a very different way, seeing him more as a revolutionary who fought for the rights of enslaved and free people of colour. And scholars who take this new viewpoint include John McLaren, who wrote a book called De-Wigged, Bothered and Bewildered, which is about judges and legal people from all over the place. But one of the chapters is about a man called Geoffrey Hart Bent, who was Chief Justice of Grenada at the same time as O'Hannan was there. And it seems that they were actually friends and supporters of each other. And what McLaren writes about is how Bent was repeatedly suspended by the local government in Grenada against the wishes of the government in London. And this is something that we see over and over again, not just in O'Hannan's story, but also in other stories from the Caribbean, that local governments and the governments back in Europe did not always agree with each other. Now, I really I think it's really interesting that there are all these different angles about O'Hannan and how his story has changed through time in academic circles. And I really, my aim here is not to write a white savior narrative. That's not it at all. I just think it's important to acknowledge how this article will sit within that wider tradition. And I also, I have to say, did not set out to write a story that is entirely about men. It just turns out that this particular story is mostly about men. And yeah, I think it's extremely interesting. So the story really begins on a Saturday, the 12th of April in 1828, when a 35-year-old Irish man named Antony O'Hannan arrived on Grenada to become its new Catholic rector. And as he approached on a boat, he would have seen more or less this image that you can see on the screen. It's an engraving from 1830. So it was made at the exact time when this story was happening. So this is what he would have seen. And you can see St. George's with the fort on the right-hand side, and there's also a church spire in the middle. And the hills, I think, are quite interesting in this picture. They have this very exaggerated steepness, which I imagine, having walked up many hills in the Caribbean, represents what it feels like to walk up them rather than how steep they actually are. But this is something that O'Hannan would have had to do probably quite often, because his congregation, which consisted of thousands of people, was spread all over the island. So he would have had to travel around a lot as part of his job as the rector. And in St. George's, there was a Catholic chapel, and it was the main chapel on the island. It was where his main focus would have been. And the congregation who came to services at that chapel was quite diverse. It consisted of a very, very large number of enslaved people, but also free people of colour, and a very small number of white French Catholics. In fact, most of his congregation was French speaking, and that's because of the French colonial history of the island. The white Catholic population was extremely small because so many of them had actually left the island in the late 18th century and early 19th century after the Phaidon Rebellion, which happened in the 1790s. And because so many Catholics were involved in that rebellion, there was this sort of stigma about Catholics afterwards, and it sort of resulted in the increased persecution of people of that religion. So that's why the congregation looked the way that it did. But for these efforts, O'Hannan got paid £500 a year, which in today's money is about 41,000 US dollars. And he spent a lot of this money setting up 5 schools for the children of free and enslaved Catholics of colour in different places of the island. He also asked the island governor to set up more chapels in different parts of the island because it was kind of difficult only having one. And it seems like the governor said to him, oh yeah, sure, great idea, I will set up some more chapels, and then never did it. It seems from what I've read that he just sort of smiled and nodded and went, yeah, sure, and then didn't do anything. Meanwhile, there were lots of divisions within the different Catholic communities. So for example, in a pamphlet, O'Hannan wrote that the white French women who were Catholics in Grenada were very displeased with him because he paid more attention to the enslaved people than he did to them. So because of these sort of frictions and setbacks within the Catholic community, in July 1829, so that's just over a year after O'Hannan got to Grenada, he boarded a boat named the Amelia, and he went to Trinidad. And Trinidad actually plays quite an important role in this story because it's where the bishop of the Catholic Caribbean was located. His name was Daniel MacDonald. So I'm going to refer to him in the rest of the presentation as Bishop MacDonald. And he's a very important character in this story. I'm going to try and keep the number of names that I mention to a minimum because there are so many people involved in this that I think it will quickly become confusing, but MacDonald's name is one definitely to remember. So when O'Hannan got to Trinidad, he and Bishop MacDonald talked, and they agreed that because of these frictions in the Grenadian Catholic community, it would be best for O'Hannan to resign his position there and instead go to Jamaica. So they agreed this. O'Hannan got on a boat back to Grenada, but when he got there, he really discovered, or it became clear that he couldn't leave his congregation. Over the past year, he built up this really strong relationship with his congregation, and they were really against him leaving. And I really want to make clear that we have lots of evidence for this from his congregation themselves, right? So the Free Catholics of Colour were extremely active and organised. They had a society. They elected O'Hannan to its board. They organised petitions and memorials again and again aimed at officials on Grenada, but also officials in London, basically arguing for why O'Hannan should be allowed to stay and to tend to his congregation. One of these petitions that they put together was signed by almost 900 people, which was 23% of the free people of colour on Grenada at that time. So that's a lot of people to be signing a petition. So you can see that he had lots of support. And we also know that he had a lot of affection for his congregation as well. So that affection seems to have gone in both directions. In his letters, when he's talking about enslaved people, for example, his tone and the types of sentences that he uses are very similar to what abolitionists at that time were saying in the Caribbean and in Europe. So, for example, in one letter, he explained that he thought it was foolish to require an enslaved woman to make a sworn statement in the presence of her master. He said, when under the influence of cruel threats and fears, there is no alternative that an enslaved person would not choose sooner than undergo the dark dungeon or the bloody lash, whose painful inflictions they may often before have felt. He also complained that the local newspaper attacked every man who shows a friendly or humane feeling for the slave. And indeed, throughout this time period, we see the newspapers repeatedly spreading rumours about O'Hannan and attacking him in the news. So at this time, the Catholic Church was rather invested in maintaining the colonial power in the region, and so they still wanted him to leave. And we see a lot of communication between Bishop MacDonald in Trinidad and the Catholic trustees in Grenada, who were white Frenchmen. So these this group of people, the trustees, and also MacDonald, they made it clear to the Grenada government, look, O'Hannan has effectively been fired. He no longer has his official position as Roman Catholic rector of Grenada. And in response to this, the president of the House of Assembly, whose job it was to oversee licenses to people like O'Hannan, revoked the government license that O'Hannan had required to preach there legally. So from this point, O'Hannan was preaching in Grenada illegally. He continued doing it. He couldn't, abandon his congregation. He continued doing it. And he also didn't believe that the license really meant anything. He thought that he and other similar men of his period thought that this relationship that he had with his congregation and with God was really just that. It was a relationship between him and God and the congregation, and that the government did not have anything to do with that. And so actually what we see is that there's a lot of communication between Grenada and the government in London at this time about the issue of the license. And we see in the London archives that the London Secretary of State and his office did not really care very much about this dispute at all. On the letters that O'Hannan and other people wrote to the Secretary of State in London, we see these pencil comments on this, almost in the margins, kind of with the comments from the Secretary of State on what was happening in Grenada. And a lot of it is very dismissive, and we don't understand what they're complaining about, and he just needs to have his license back. And there's often sort of just something is underlined, and then they've put, several exclamation marks at the side just to sort of demonstrate how, noteworthy they think something is. But it's really dismissive. And so it really demonstrates this difference of opinion between London and Grenada governments. So some of the other things that O'Hannan was being accused of in these letters include starting a riot, which there was no evidence for, but that was one of those things that went into the newspaper and suddenly everyone thought it was true. So really the metropolitan powers were not understanding exactly what was happening on the ground in Grenada. The situation on the ground was actually one of profound anxiety. I mentioned the Fedon rebellion before that happened in the 1790s, and that lots of Catholics on Grenada were involved in. So the Grenadian government was remembering those events and then looking at O'Hannan and thinking, wow, he really has a lot of influence with his congregation. Maybe he would have enough influence to incite another rebellion. So that was their ultimate fear. So at this time, Bishop MacDonald in Trinidad sent 2 priests to replace O'Hannan. And actually, it seems like the priests he sent were not particularly well suited for the job. One of them only spoke Spanish, so he spoke neither of the languages that were required to communicate with the population in Grenada. But anyway, I suppose MacDonald thought, if I can replace O'Hannan, then he becomes obsolete and the problem is sort of dealt with. So with these 2 new priests, he sent a very important French vicar general named William Le Goff to oversee the transition from O'Hannan to the 2 new priests. And yeah, I said I wasn't going to mention many names, but this one is perhaps an important one as well. So Le Goff, the vicar general from Trinidad. And actually, it was while I was reading a letter from this Vicar General Le Goff to the Grenada government, that's when I fell in love with history as a discipline, because Le Goff is, I think, the most dramatic man I have ever heard of. His letter describes how he went to the chapel to read an address from the Bishop MacDonald to the Grenada congregation. And when he got to the chapel, there was a large crowd of people standing outside. So because he couldn't get in through the front door, he, I guess, went round the side and went into the vestry. And O'Hannan was waiting for him in the vestry. And in Le Goff's letter, he says that O'Hannan looked at him, quote unquote, wildly, and said, "I do not want you here." And this was apparently so intimidating to Le Goff that he immediately left. He was hurrying away from the chapel, and he writes in his letter to the government, he complains that some low, dirty girls only laughed at him as he went away. He also complains in his letter how dangerous O'Hannan is, at one point using 6 exclamation marks to underline this. So you can see how strongly he felt. And I think it's really astonishing also to watch this man who feels the need to complain to the island governor that some girls laughed at him. Now, this might be partly explained by Le Goff's personal history. So he'd actually fled to the Caribbean from France because of the revolution. And he was extremely conservative. He definitely supported the colonial powers. And so I think this would have really predisposed him to be against O'Hannan and everything that he stood for. And there were several other very dramatic events that happened during the remainder of 1829 and the beginning of 1830. One of them is that there was a member of the government who was sleeping in his house when someone threw large stones through the window, and one of the large stones almost hit his child on the head. So that was a very serious incident that people were very concerned about. But the newspapers, when they reported this story, they said, well, it must have been something to do with O'Hannan, because throwing stones through windows is something that we think Irish people would do. So you can see that even though O'Hannan wasn't there, he was still getting blamed for this event. And that's sort of the level of suspicion that people had for him at this point. So the two new priests, absolute failure. They went away, Le Goff went away, and Bishop MacDonald decided to try again. So he sends another priest to try and replace O'Hannan. This new priest was named Samuel Power. And he was a young man. He was a few years younger than O'Hannan. He was also of Irish ancestry, so they had a couple of things in common. And he actually arrived on the island feeling very well disposed towards the government. He'd been put in this position by Bishop MacDonald, who was very important, and he had the goodwill of the Grenada government, presumably because they thought he would get rid of O'Hannan. So he starts preaching and he sort of gets into his life in Grenada and everything is fine. And then one day he comes down with a virus and he feels really ill, and he sends a letter to O'Hannan saying, look, I can't take the service today. I'm really sorry, but you know the congregation. You know French and English. Please, will you do the service for me? I'm not feeling very well. So on that Sunday, O'Hannan goes to take the service at the chapel, and the government finds out about this, I think, almost immediately. And Samuel Power realizes that they're pretty angry about it. The reason for this is, as I said before, O'Hannan no longer has a government license. So according to the government, he's preaching illegally, and now Samuel Power has helped him to do that. So Samuel Power sends this quite irate letter to the government saying, this is ridiculous, what is going on? And with his letter, he sends back his license. And the person who receives this letter in the Grenada government interprets this as Samuel Power giving up his license, as him effectively quitting. But that's not what he meant at all. He just meant, I don't need this because I'm here doing God's work and I have a relationship with my congregation, and that's all that I need. I don't need the Grenadian government's piece of paper, basically. And so that puts this very sort of antagonistic relationship also between the Grenada government and with Samuel Power. And Samuel Power and O'Hannan, clearly, I think they already were on good terms before that, but now they become definitely allies. And shortly after that, I think in the eyes of the Grenada government, Samuel Power is sort of disgraced, and he also leaves the island, and he actually goes to Trinidad, where there's another Catholic priest named Francis de Ridder, who is trying to fight for the rights of enslaved and free people of Canada. And what I think they were all friends, actually. So O'Hannan, Power, and de Ridder, they were all described as friends in letters. But one thing that made Francis de Ridder stand out is that he was a man of color himself. So in Trinidad, he was fighting for the rights of his own community, and also probably, experienced a lot of other setbacks that O'Hannan and Power did not face. But I think it's really interesting that there are all of these young men at the same time in the sort of late 1820s, early 1830s, fighting for the same thing in the Caribbean. So what's really important, I think, if we want to look at rumours in this particular case, is what happened in the summer of 1830. So that's after all of these dramatic events have happened. And in that summer, white Catholic men across the Lesser Antilles engaged in their next attempt to get rid of O'Hannan. So at this point, we've seen the Catholic Church try and get rid of him by their own administrative means. We've seen the Grenada government try and get rid of him through revoking his license, but neither of those things have worked. O'Hannan is still there. He's still tending to his congregation, and they don't seem to be able to get rid of him. So what they do is they join forces, and that was quite extraordinary because, as I said, after the Fedon Rebellion, the Catholic community really suffered quite a lot under the British government. And usually the Grenadian government and the white French-speaking Catholics would not have been natural allies. But here we see them working together. And actually, I think this is particularly interesting also in terms of rumour, because historians often associate rumouring in the Caribbean with enslaved people and with sailors. So sailors are the ones who usually transmit rumours. They're the ones who move all around the Caribbean all the time. And there are also very many examples of rumours in history that went around before and after rebellions and revolts, like the Faidon Rebellion. But rumours are less often associated with elite white men. And this is a case, I think, that speaks really well to the fact that everyone in the society is rumouring, right? Yeah, so with that in mind, now I turn to the point. So it was a very long introduction, but we have got to the research questions. So here are the questions that I wanted to answer when I was looking at this case study. I wanted to know who the rumouring in-group was. So who are the people who hear these rumours, who pass them on, and where are they in the Lesser Antilles? Secondly, I wanted to know what the rumours were for, what their purpose was, what was their intended impact. And thirdly, I wanted to explore what the rumouring about O'Hannan says about inter-island networks in the Lesser Antilles. And that last question is sort of directly keyed into the goals of In the Same Sea, which is the project that I work in. So the reason that we can read about these rumours today is that in the summer of 1830, the governor of Grenada returned from a trip to London to find the whole island in an absolute uproar about what was happening in the Catholic community. So this drama was filling the newspapers. It was being delivered into every home. People were reading about it all the time. O'Hannan had been accused of theft of valuable items from the chapel. And he'd also, as I mentioned before, been accused of starting a riot. So the governor, thinking, okay, I have to do something about this, he asked the president of the House of Assembly to find proof of O'Hannan's dangerous character, proof that could be used to get rid of him in a court of law. Now, courts of law worked quite a bit differently back then. Proofs were often no more than sworn statements from witnesses or from individuals. So the president of the House of Assembly in Grenada went on a trip to Trinidad to try and basically dig up some dirt on O'Hannan. And he tapped into this network of white Catholic planters, gentlemen, and merchants that stretched not only across Grenada and Trinidad, but also to Montserrat and St. Bart's as well. And these rumours that he collected fall into two main constellations. You'll see in a moment why I call them constellations instead of just single rumours. The first of these is that of an incident that is supposed to have taken place somewhere in North America, where O'Hannan and an accomplice, who was also an Irish priest, were accused of rape or seduction. And 4 men in this rumour network all swore that Bishop MacDonald himself had mentioned this incident to them in December 1829 when he was visiting Grenada. And then there were 2 other men in this rumour network who swore that they had read about the same incident in an Irish newspaper. However, Bishop MacDonald himself did not swear about these events in North America. So in the archive, you see all these sworn statements from the men that MacDonald told the rumour to. But when it comes to the time for MacDonald to make his own sworn statement, he refuses to swear to this rumour that he told, which I think is really interesting. He doesn't want to be pinned down to this thing that he's spread around. But he does complain about O'Hannan ignoring the fact that his license was revoked. That's the main thing that he says. So yeah, there's a lot of ambiguity in this rumour that's going around. The event may have taken place in New York or Canada or South Carolina. No one can agree. And O'Hannan might have been accused of rape or seduction or of being an accessory to rape, and at some point also of perjury. So one of the letters says that he's supposed to have paid a woman to lie for him in court. So some of the people who are spreading these rumours, they say that O'Hannan was convicted, but other people say that they suspect that he was guilty or they can't remember the outcome of the case. And in the London archive, at this part where it says the person can't remember what the outcome of the case was, the person in the office of the Secretary of State has underlined it and then written some exclamation marks at the side. And I think we can interpret that as they just think this is ridiculous. Like, you can't say this, it's not evidence. And then finally, in this rumour constellation, yeah, O'Hannan was also accused of indirectly causing the death of the Bishop of Quebec, who was supposed to have expired from shock when he heard what had happened. But no one could produce the Irish newspaper that's supposed to have reported this incident. No one could even name the newspaper. And the Bishop of Quebec, who was supposed to have died, actually never existed. So this rumor it's like smoke. It has so many details that change according to who is telling the story. It has so many facts that can't be corroborated. It's like smoke. The second of these rumor constellations says that O'Hannan seduced a quote unquote very respectable young lady of Montserrat who became pregnant and then went to live with O'Hannan on Grenada. But no concrete details are provided about this. So no one mentions the name of the young lady, and no one says like how they know that she became pregnant by O'Hannan. So it's actually quite a lazy rumor, I think, that one. It just has no details at all. And then the other part of this second rumor constellation is about something that happened on St. Bart's in April 1827, when O'Hannan is supposed to have been the cause of unrest between the Catholic and the Methodist communities there. So it's said that he led this riotous attack on the Methodist church in the middle of a service, where thrown stones seriously injured another young lady of respectability. So I think the use of two respectable young ladies in this rumor constellation as the alleged victims seems designed to play upon the anxieties of these colonial elites. So these young ladies, they represent symbols of white womanly virtue assailed by a dangerous man. And I also think it's interesting that the thrown stones thing comes in again here. But ultimately, you know, we can think about these rumors for as long as we like, but it's 200 years ago, so we will never know for sure if any of these rumors were true. But actually, for the purposes of this study, whether or not they were true is beside the point. Here we see the Catholic and the secular authorities in Grenada and Trinidad working together to activate an inter-island network in order to recover information that would be bad for O'Hannan. The rumors passed between people who moved in the same social circles. So this is all elite white men, despite the fact that they live on different islands, they have different nationalities and different occupations. And it potentially confirms their stereotypes, their beliefs that they held about people who they considered too close to the free people of colour and to the enslaved population, like O'Hannan. So on this slide, we're just looking at the scales at which this rumour network operates. So on the local scale, we have Grenada. Obviously, it's important that some of these rumours are being passed in Grenada. In particular, that incident in December 1829, when Bishop MacDonald is supposed to have told 4 separate people about what O'Hannan had done in North America. And then at the micro-regional scale, we see it expanding outwards to encompass Trinidad, which is very important, but also Montserrat and St. Bart's. And then at the macro scale, we see, you know, these events in the United States and potentially Canada, but also this Irish newspaper. And I think it's important because these 3 different scales, they all overlap with each other. So without the local scale in Grenada of rumour networks there, you wouldn't be able to access the rumours that are going around in the micro scale of the Lesser Antilles. And without those, you don't get to access the rumours that are going around at the macro scale in North America and in Ireland. So this map, I think, is particularly important for the goals of In the Same Sea, because it really shows these sort of intercolonial links between the islands and the way that the Lesser Antilles is sort of keyed into these different scales of information exchange. So from all of this, I could make some conclusions. Rumour was an important weapon in the arsenal of elite white men who wanted to maintain the colonial status quo. And here they used it as a last resort. So they'd exhausted all of their administrative attempts to get rid of O'Hannan, and then this is what they tried next. And the Catholic and the colonial powers, who were usually at odds with each other in Grenada, were willing to collaborate to get rid of a man who they saw as a threat to the colonial order. And so this shows that in this particular case, what bound these different groups of people together was actually their race and their colonial investment, basically, rather than their religion. They put their religious differences aside and they sort of banded together against O'Hannan. And in the article that I've written about this, but not yet submitted to the journal, I actually talk a lot more about the newspapers, because they're super important in this case. They relay everything that happens. I get the impression that the whole island was just glued to what was going on. And in fact, there were also papers in Trinidad that also followed quite a lot of what was happening. So we also see this news exchange in a printed form between Grenada and Trinidad as well. But yeah, they really played this very important role in exaggerating the situation and also in providing a platform for Bishop MacDonald and Antony O'Hannan to address the congregation in a very sort of broad way. And the sermons that they both print in the newspapers are extremely different. It's so interesting to see how they address the congregation. Bishop MacDonald's addresses in the newspaper are quite dry and sort of they talk down to the congregation, whereas Antony O'Hannan's are much more accessible. He writes in a much more conversational manner and really seems to write with a lot of love for his congregation in a way that MacDonald does not. And of course, there are these overlapping scales that I mentioned in the previous slide. But what happened to O'Hannan after all of this? So actually, all this rumouring that they did, all the effort that these people put into trying to bring him down, it didn't work. So he remained in Grenada. He got his license back in 1832 and was able to again preach legally. And he actually stayed on Grenada for the rest of his life, and he died there in 1840. So it might be that the colonial powers decided it was more dangerous to try and forcibly remove him than it was to let him stay, because he had so much sway with his congregation. And yeah, he had this large sort of loving community of people supporting him. It's quite difficult to, get rid of someone who has that much support. And I suppose both of these things could have been true. This is only a couple of years before the abolition of slavery, and it could be that the colonial powers thought, well, if we let O'Hannan stay, then perhaps he will be able to smooth this transition from slavery to freedom. So finally, as I mentioned before, he was one of several young priests at this time period who were originally Catholic pastors who were sort of setting themselves up against the Catholic and the secular powers. And there's actually a really, really interesting article about Francis de Ridder if you want to read more about him, and also about Samuel Power. So before I go, there's one more thing that I want to mention. Next year, in February, there is a conference on St. Thomas in the US Virgin Islands. It's called Inter-Island Connections in the Lesser Antilles, Family, Friends and Institutions Across the Sea. And it's organised by In the Same Sea in collaboration with the Caribbean Genealogy Library. So there are going to be lots of different themes of the conference, and they wouldn't all fit onto this slide. So you can see some of them, but there are some others that I'll just read out to you. So it also covers religious communities and inter-island faith, shoreline memories, fishing together, relaxing together, female friendships, sports development, travel for sports, educational networks, and conducting research in the Lesser Antilles, but also looking forward to the future. What is the future of this type of research in the Lesser Antilles, including genealogical research? So if you want to know more about this, you can email Hannah. Her email is on the slide. And what we're really looking for is, this is not supposed to be a conference just for academics. It's supposed to be a conference for everyone. So it would be really great to have a lot of people there who research their own family history, and then we can all share knowledge with each other. So I think it's pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to going to that. And finally, thank you so much for your attention on this whistle-stop tour through the extremely complicated Antony O'Hannan case. I really hope that you found it interesting, and I look forward to your questions so much. I've enjoyed researching this so much, and it's great to be able to share it with you. And if you have any more questions after this event, or you want to talk about something else, you're really welcome to contact me. I am available on all of these platforms. Thanks very much.
Okay, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And we have some questions. So let's go ahead and start the Q&A. And if anybody thinks of a question in the next few minutes, please type it in the comments in the live stream. So one question is, did any of O'Hannan's predecessors have a similarly strong relationship with their congregations?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually don't know. That's not something that I've researched. One thing that I do know is that the priest who was there before O'Hannan seems also to have caused problems for the island government. And so when O'Hannan arrived, he initially had this very positive reaction from the government. basically because he wasn't the previous guy. And so I wonder if that does mean that the previous priest was similar, but I don't know. I haven't been able to find anything about that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It might do.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned some of the rumors about O'Hannan's past. Was there anything that was that you saw that was factual that might have foreshadowed that he would have this kind of advocacy approach? Did he have like
from
a history
previous
of that?
years?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I haven't really read that much about him in previous years. It's because the way the archive is structured is I found him basically within this huge, massive tome that mainly looks at Geoffrey Hart Bent, the judge who got suspended, who I mentioned at the beginning. So because Bent and O'Hannan were close and they supported each other, all of the stuff about O'Hannan is like contained inside the file that belongs to Bent. And I haven't, because I was focusing on the rumors, I haven't really looked that much in other places. But for example, I do know that in later years, so between the rumors that I've been looking at and when O'Hannan died, he did go to Rome and he met with the Pope. And so there are also letters that exist between O'Hannan and the Pope, but I haven't looked at those because they're not anything to do with rumors. But there is definitely a lot more to be done here, which, I mean, this is one of the problems with academia. You find these really amazing stories and you want to just follow them until they get to the end. But I find that, unfortunately.
Fascinating. Well, maybe somebody watching will kind of dive into the archives, find something. Let's see. We have a question from Peter Antoine. Would there be any other instances of the radicalism in the church leading up to and during the Fedon Rebellion? That's probably not in the scope of what you were studying, but did you run across anything like that? Or
I think the person to ask about that would be Heather Freund. She's the other postdoc on the project that I'm in, and she did study the Fedon Rebellion during her PhD. So I'm sure she knows the answer to that question.
Great.
I didn't study that time period, but there were those two other priests I mentioned at the same time as O'Hannan, Samuel Power and Francis de Ridder. Okay.
I was thinking about when you mentioned somebody said throwing rocks through windows is something Irish people would do. That made me wonder, what's your sense of how his Irish ethnicity figured into the rumor mongering and kind of the dim view of him?
Yeah, I think it had a big impact. One of the things that I tried to do actually in the article is to look at the reasons why all these different groups of people looked at O'Hannan the way that they did. And I think that's one of them. I also wonder at this time, if you're a Catholic priest, you will be considered sort of at the top echelon if you attended Oxbridge. And he didn't attend Oxbridge. So I think already then in the eyes of the elites in Grenada, that's sort of almost one strike against him. Also, he's Irish, he's young, and he's just come from Montserrat. That was the job that he had before Grenada. And at that time, Montserrat was a very Irish island and a very Catholic island. So there, I think he would have had a lot more support and possibly felt initially more at home than he did in Grenada because of its different population makeup. But I can't even remember what the question was now. I got too carried away.
How did his ethnicity fit in?
I think it did. Yeah, because they mentioned the stone throwing, and then it also happened when he was on Montserrat, or it's supposed to have happened when he was on St. Bart's also with the Methodist Church.
Do you, in terms of the regions of Grenada, was he mostly in the capital, or did you see anything about him in other regions like Guave or anywhere else? Yeah,
so it seems like he was traveling around all the time. There's one bit when he is submitting these very long letters to the Grenada government trying to defend himself. So he's received all of this documentation that spreads these horrible rumors about him, and he's allowed to respond. So he writes these very long letters saying, oh, that can't be true, that bishop never existed, all of this stuff. And then during that exact time period when he's firing off all of these letters trying to defend himself, I think it's in the newspaper, it also gets reported that he's been traveling around to different to different parts of the island to look after his congregation. So he goes to St. Andrews, and he goes to St. Patrick's, and that's within like a few days of each other. So it seems like he was traveling a lot. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Let's see. I'm curious about when you're doing this research, and so much of it involves all of the social dynamics between the groups.
Yeah.
What are your kind of top like light bulb moments that that surprised you about the kind of social structure at the time?
I think I mean, obviously every island had quite a different social structure during this time period, but I think the bits that I found most interesting here were how small the white French Catholic community was. The Catholic trustees, for example, they send their letters to the government in French, and then they have to be translated for the government. So they seem almost quite isolated. So I thought that was interesting. And also, I think one particular light bulb moment was when I read, it's one of the petitions from the Free Catholics of Color, and I counted the number of signatures. I think it's like 876 signatures or something like that. It's just so many people. Wow. And then there were lots of other petitions and memorials as well, but that was the one that was signed by the largest number of people. And then I discovered that was, a quarter of the population of free people of color on Grenada, which I mean, for a petition, that's an astonishing number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We do have another question. I'm going to paraphrase it. It's about rumoring. Is that a theme that comes up? This might not have been something you've studied because it's kind of more about other cases, but have you run across rumoring used as a tool like this in other situations? Not
exactly like this, no. So I think that's one of the things that makes this case interesting, that it is these elite men trying to weaponize rumor. I haven't read anything else like that. I did try and do a lot of research also in sociology for this, because I thought it was important to understand the psychology of rumor. Why do people do it? How does it happen? But yeah, no, I didn't find any other cases like this. They were mostly to do with rebellions and that kind of thing. But there was one area where missionaries were involved. So it seems that after revolts and rebellions during the sort of 18th century, missionaries would often get singled out by the local government and like blamed for spreading rumors, even if they hadn't been. And so it seems that there is already this kind of link between religious figures and rumor. But even though in this case, obviously, O'Hannan is not spreading these rumors, he spreads other rumors. There's a rumor that he's going to be reinstated because London told the Grenada government, you have to give him his license back. And I guess O'Hannan would have found out about that, and then he spreads that rumor, which I suppose would have been beneficial for him, because if his congregation know that the Secretary of State wants him to be reinstated, then they have a very legitimate reason to be angry if he doesn't get reinstated.
Right.
So we also see him using it.
Interesting. We do have a question from Jonathan Hanna, who is responsible for introducing you to us. So thank you, Jonathan.
Yes, thank you so much, Sean.
And Jonathan's question is, I'll just read it verbatim. Maybe this relates to the Irish rock throwing, but you seem to suggest that the content of the rumors was symbolic of the beliefs of the men spreading them. Maybe this is more a psychological question, but was there any other example of these rumors shedding light on the person spreading the rumor?
Yes. So this is one of the most important things, I think, when you're studying rumors, that if you receive a rumor, whether or not you spread it is going to be based on what meaning it has for you. And so we see rumors building a community of people that all spread the same thing. How can I say this in a more detailed way? Psychologically, it's extremely interesting that people spread rumors that confirm things that they already believe. And if the rumor is not detailed enough, they will fill in the gaps with stuff that is made up. And that's not something that only happened in the 1820s in the Caribbean. It's something that we still do. And it's something that you can see happening on Twitter.
Oh, yeah. I'm curious
Yeah.
too, the rumoring, I mean, is this case special because kind of the elite whites were rumoring about another white person, or was rumoring about an enslaved person or a free person of color, was that all kind of the norm, or was that equally as, not done? Did it have to do with O'Hannan's ethnicity that, makes the rumoring unusual?
So one of the things that I think rumor and gossip have in common, like obviously these two genres overlap, but I think one of the things that they have in common is that they are used sometimes to try and police the boundaries of a specific community. So if one person in a group is perceived to have like stepped outside the social norm of what is acceptable, then by gossiping about that and rumoring about it, you can sort of make sure that everyone else in the group stays in line. That's one of the social functions that these rumors and pieces of gossip play.
Interesting. So it's kind of a way to maintain the structure of the groups and the hierarchy of the groups. We have about 5 more minutes. So a couple more questions. This one is from Carol Regis. Carol is an admin in the Trinidad genealogical group, which everybody should check out. What do you have on O'Hannan setting up his own church and how that ended?
He doesn't actually say very much about this in the stuff that I've read for it, but I know that it did happen, and I get the impression from what Angus has written about this that it was attached to one of the schools that he set up.
Okay.
But I don't know much more about it. I'm sorry.
So Angus mentioned it in the Grenada A to Z book. Okay, so maybe we can.
There's also a picture of the building.
That.
Yeah.
Or ask Angus, who is an admin in our group. See what he says. Let's see. How about one more question? So all of this happened right before emancipation, and everybody knew that was coming. Yeah. Do you think that, the timeline of it, the context, in that context was either the environment extra charged in some way for this to happen, or how did the context time-wise play into this?
Yeah, I think that did certainly play into the sort of heightened anxiety that the elites were feeling at this time, but there were also other things that fed into that. For example, I think the sugar market was crashing, and there'd been some hurricanes, and wars were still going on all over the Caribbean, and so it was a time of sort of uncertainty and unrest in general. And I think that makes people feel very anxious.
Yeah. All right. So any next steps on this research that you have in mind, or I know you're about to publish the paper.
Hopefully. So this is the first history paper I've ever written. So I'm pretty excited to see what will happen next. If anyone after this presentation really wants to read it before I publish it, you are so welcome. You can just email me. I'm so open to having further chats about this. That I aim to submit to the journal before Christmas. The only reason for that is that then I can go on Christmas holiday and already have submitted.
Great deadline.
But then, because of how publishing happens, there will be a few months where the journal is looking at it and sending it to reviewers, and then I will get another opportunity to amend it after the reviewers have left their comments. So even after I've submitted it, there's still time for it to change and evolve. And if anyone has any specific comments about that, then great. I can still correct any mistakes that I've made.
Can you give us any teaser about kind of your next research questions you want to tackle?
Yeah, so at the moment I'm doing a vast amount of data entry for my next
sounds exciting
article in history. Oh yes. But it's okay because you can listen to a podcast while you're doing it. And that article will be about trade connections between 2 free ports in the Lesser Antilles. So it will be about St. Thomas and Curacao. And these are 2 islands that acquired free ports at the beginning of the 19th century, about a decade apart. And what I want to do is compare how the shipping networks changed around those two free ports when they became free ports.
Nice.
And that whole time period is a period of kind of stagnation in shipping in the Lesser Antilles. And I think that has meant that people haven't really looked at it before, because people seem more interested in like the peaks of things. They tend to look at like, oh, there's loads of shipping then, let's look at that. That in this time period, there's not so much. So I think, it's unexplored territory.
Nice. And for people who are not aware of the distinction between a free port and a port.
So there was lots of trade restrictions during this time period in the Caribbean, basically because colonial powers wanted to keep all of the profit and money for themselves. And so when an island became a free port, that meant that people from other nations were allowed to come and trade there. And there might also be sort of tax incentives and that kind of thing. I think one of the most famous ones was St. Eustatius. But by the time period that I study, St. Eustatius is no longer a particularly busy port.
And I would imagine that would mean that a lot of people, a lot of what we're doing in the group is genealogy, and I would imagine there's a lot of genealogical implications for a free port with people physically moving and living.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was an attractive place to go, indeed, because you could make money.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much. It's 3 minutes till the hour, and that was a great presentation. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and everyone, I put links to Felicia's website and to her Google Scholar page in the comments if you want to read more. And she also shared her contact information. So please reach out with questions. And thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
All right.
Thank you, you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.